Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Julie Bondren, a senior director here at Morning Consult, and I'm joined by John Lear, our chief economist, and Kayla Broom, our head of economic analysis. We're going to spend our time today walking through what's been happening with high-income consumer sentiment. The drop has been pretty dramatic, and we'll talk about why this time looks different and what it means if your business depends on this group. As a quick roadmap, I'll spend a few minutes on who we are and what we do, and then I'll hand it over to John and Kayla for the analysis. We'll save some time for questions at the end, and we'll share how you can dig into this data for your own customers if it's relevant. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our panelists as we go. We're going to try to keep the session to 30 minutes, but I should note that we may go over because we have a lot of new content, especially with the Supreme Court tariff news. But the webinar is being recorded in case you can't stay long. To contextualize what we'll be talking about this afternoon, executives are trying to plan in an environment where things are changing fast. Tariffs are shifting how people shop, geopolitical tensions, conflict in Ukraine, the Middle East, US-China relations, they're all creating volatility. There's real anxiety about the labor market, even among high earners, and the AI conversation is creating uncertainty about jobs and income. What our clients tell us is they need to know what's happening with their customers before it shows up in quarterly sales numbers. What they need is an early warning system, leading indicators of how people will react and how that will affect their bottom line so they can actually do something about it. And that's what we've built, a way to see these changes as they're happening, not after the fact. For more than a decade, Morning Consult has been collecting high-quality consumer data at scale. We're the largest purchaser of sample in the world. We've run 30,000 surveys every day in 45 countries, and to date, we've conducted more than 100 million surveys. We track everything from brand perceptions and corporate reputation to macroeconomic trends and geopolitical events. And we pair that with granular data on consumer psychographics, purchasing behavior, media consumption, and evolving work habits. All of these inputs come together to create a comprehensive real-time map of consumer behavior so you can understand how consumer financial health is actually affecting brand performance or how labor market anxiety is showing up in purchase delays. So when something like this drop in high income sentiment happens, our clients can understand in real time which of their customer segments are pulling back and make decisions while there's still time to adjust rather than reacting to last quarter's results. We aren't just measuring consumers, we're mapping the full ecosystem of human behavior every day. So with that context, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Lear, to walk us through what we're actually seeing in the data.
Thank you so much, Julie. Great to be with everyone. My name is John Lear. I'm the chief economist here. And we're going to talk today about what we've seen in Morning Consult's high frequency data, why we think this change and this downshift in sentiment is occurring, and then what we think it means for a range of different businesses across industries. So if you go to the next slide, Julie, I just want to make sure that everyone sees at the very top, kind of high level, where we see the US economy right now. And the big takeaway is, I think pretty clearly we have seen a downshift in economic activity from, let's say, late 2025 through early 2026. You see that in the downgrade in consumer sentiment, which we're going to really dive into. We see it in some weakening measures of the labor market, particularly our pay loss rate indicator. Um, there's a sense that maybe this K-shaped economy that we've experienced has sort of reached peak K, and we're starting to narrow in. And then I think as we look ahead, we continue to see higher income consumers as remaining resilient when it comes to spending, when it remains, when it comes to their debt levels and their debt servicing capacity. But there certainly are signs, particularly as the labor market weakens, that sort of source of growth for the U.S. economy is jeopardized in 2026. So with that, let me dive in and just show you some of the data here, and so you guys get a really clear sense of what's going on. So the date on the far right-hand side is December 27th. I've used months, but just to be very clear, it's December 27th is the turning point in this data set. This is Morning Consult's daily consumer sentiment data. I analyze it at least once every week for our weekly analysis that goes out, hopefully to many folks on this call. What we saw there was the beginning of a precipitous decrease in consumer sentiment among that high income group. It was surprising, I think, because, well, there's a lot of reasons why it was surprising, but one was that it was unprompted, at least when you looked at the news of the time, and when you looked at the stock market. And I think it's also important just to kind of contextualize it here relative to the last year and a half immediately prior to Trump's election. I mean, this decrease in sentiment in roughly 2 weeks roughly gave back all the gains that high income group had made over the course of 2025. So it was really an alarming development. And if you go one more here, you can contextualize this even further, or sorry, you can break it down into the subcomponents. I mean, when we talk about consumer sentiment, it's a nebulous term for a lot of folks, but we are just asking 5 questions. Two of them are about consumers' personal financial conditions, two of them are about broader macroeconomic activity and expectations, and then the last is about current buying conditions. All 5 of those indicators that go into that top line consumer sentiment data point fell starting roughly at the same time, the end of December. Now they fell at different degrees, but if you bear with me and try to read through some of all these colors, this was different than what we saw in earlier in the year when the tariff announcements were made. And so at the very bottom of this line here, that net personal finances current conditions line, if you go back and you're looking on the left-hand side here, October 2024, it actually pretty steadily rose through, following the election, remained stable through Q1, early Q2 of 2025, even as all the other indicators were starting to fall. So essentially, people were saying that the future looked really bleak because of tariffs, but the present still, price increases had not impacted them. That is different than the period that we experienced just a few weeks ago, where all 5 of these indicators pretty significantly moved lower. And to get a sense of that significance, you can go back and play it back over time, Julie, and you can look at all the historical data. Sorry, let me just wait one second. Just to get a sense, again, of kind of the magnitude of this drop off. I think, if you hyper focus on the last year, the last 2 years, you maybe lose some of the broader context. That 17.8, almost 19, almost 18-point drop in consumer sentiment is really only matched by or surpassed by the drop in sentiment that we saw immediately following and during COVID-19. So late February, early March 2020. That was a phenomenal kind of once in a generation period. So the fact that we were even sort of nearing that level of magnitude, I think was very, very alarming. If you go to the next slide, Julie, one of the ways that I think very hard around measuring the impact or the size of these changes is thinking about some measure of change over time. And so in this case, I'm looking at that index of consumer sentiment relative to where it was 30 days ago. That's valuable for a couple of reasons, but one is that, as consumer sentiment over the course of 2025 rose and people had decreasing expectations of tariffs actually impacting their business, and maybe they were a little high from Trump, that higher level actually means that the percentage change is going to be a little less for a constant magnitude and fall. So that kind of gives you a sense here, right? That even though this is the second largest point fall in terms of percentage points, it's really comparable to many of the things that we had seen over the course of the last few years, particularly, the elevated period of inflation that we saw in June 2022, roughly half of what we saw, over the COVID period. So there's a lot of valuable context that you get from playing out this current period relative to what we've seen historically. I will say, again, if you look at the descriptions and all of these prior kind of issues, they are all in some way tied to stock market issues or broader economic issues. There's nothing in the stock market right now. We are reaching record highs, it seems like every day. And so there is now a really a surprising, I think, disconnect between how high income consumers are feeling about their personal finances in the broader economy and what the stock market is telling us. And that is a trend, I think, that is going to be extremely valuable and important to monitor over the course of 2026, when there's a potential, right, for some of this labor market downturn to actually have positive effect on corporate earnings but obviously, I think a negative short-term effect on real wages and job growth. If you go one more, Julie, I think Kayla maybe can come in here and describe sort of why we think this is so important. But this is a group that is accounting for a lot of growth in the economy. So I'll let Kayla dive in and explain what we've seen.
Yeah, and thank you, John. And some of this was already sort of previewed in John's slides. We've focused very much on that drop that we've seen in early 2026, but I just wanted to bring up some of our spending data to kind of drive home the point of how important the high income group is for spending overall, the economy overall. We mentioned the K-shaped economy. That really was the big economic story, especially towards the end of 2025. I'm sure you've seen many charts out there with K-shapes. There will be more later on in this deck as well. Um, this is maybe not the most K-shaped chart I've even had to show, but I've intentionally cut it off actually to ending in December 2025 for this chart on the left to really just sort of show how average spending growth for the year was really supported by the high income adults. Not only, as you see on the left, is their, average spending level per month much higher, as we would all assume, but it was growing faster. So that widening K shape and like the actual dollars being spent, so much of it depends on this group. And so this is more just sort of context setting and yeah, really driving home. This is what we've seen. This is a little bit more of a backwards looking slide. This is where we're coming from in terms of the spending, the actual dollars going out the door, the actual really engine of economic growth, really, because consumer spending is such a big part of it. And how important the high income cohort is to that.
I think, if we think about, so what we've shown thus far is that there's been this sort of massive decrease in sentiment. Consumers are clearly on edge. The consumer group that is the most on edge right now happens to also be the one that has most significantly driven consumer spending, the broader macro economy. I think for many folks on this call, this is also the group that accounts for a large share of total sales. And so it's a really top of mind issue, both for macroeconomists, but also for companies. So then the question, I think, naturally is why? What is going on here that's driving this downturn? And there's some simple answers, and I think some not so simple answers, and we'll try to get into both of those here. So, Julie, if you go to the next slide, you can see to some extent, I think a lot of the jitters that happened in sentiment at the end of December reflect a weakening labor market affecting high income consumers. So we got a lot of squiggly lines. I'm an economist. I like squiggly line graphs. What we are showing you here is Morning Consult's proprietary pay loss rate data. Every week, we're talking to 10,000 people. We ask them a very basic question. Did you lose pay or income in the prior week? It's really valuable for tracking trends over time, and not necessarily relying on government data, particularly I'm thinking about unemployment insurance claims data that require people to go ahead and file for claims, which is an additional step. So here we're getting kind of like a true source of whether or not people lost pay or income. The thing that is interesting in this graph is that, starting pretty clearly with the announcement of tariffs around Liberation Day, that lower income group, the teal line, started increasingly saying that they lost pay or income. But while that was happening, high income groups, the bottom purple line, remained essentially flat or steady through the first 3 quarters of 2025. So there was this sense over the course of 2025 that not only were tariffs going to affect the prices disproportionately of lower income adults, but they were also going to impact the purchasing power through weaker labor market conditions, I think via policy uncertainty. What we started to see at the end of 2025, and this is on the right-hand side here, is that actually there was a pretty marked increase in the reported pay loss rate of high-income adults starting at the end of December. So what this suggests to us, not necessarily that these people are being laid off, but rather that they're having their hours cut. There's some sort of reduction in wages that's happening that's limiting their purchasing power. And we see that then again reflected in the consumer sentiment data. I think one of the puzzles when you look at this is you kind of have to squint to see this increase in the purple line. It seems a little disproportionate to attribute that full drop in sentiment to, a percentage point increase in the pay loss rate for this group. And so I think there's more going on here. It's not just about this particular kind of, near-term moment. There's a longer term anxiety that is also sweeping across this higher income group, and that's what I'm going to try to show you in the next slide. Um, which is that on the left-hand side, we're tracking, this is essentially pay loss expectations. Do you think that you'll experience a loss of employment income in the next 4 weeks? And here we're just asking employed adults. And so what we have seen on this slide is pretty consistently over the course of 2025, up through the end of 2025, adults who are employed increasingly expect to lose pay or to become unemployed in the next four weeks, like a near-term increase in job insecurity. Okay, so everyone's like worried that they're going to get fired. That's point A. Point B is the right-hand side, which is we're showing longer-term job loss concerns. So do you think that your job is going to be eliminated over the next 10 years? I take this as being a really strong kind of proxy for all the concerns around AI and what it might mean for AI automation. Here again, we've seen a pretty consistent increase in the share of employed adults saying they're somewhat or very concerned that their job will be totally eliminated over 10 years. And so I think there's basically two forces at play. You've got this very clear near-term impact of a weaker labor market, making consumers very concerned. But then on top of that, the broader environment is one where consumers are already, or workers, I should say, workers are already on their edge because there's this growing sense that they are going to have to navigate a labor market that does not directly meet their skill set as it is right now, or I should say, doesn't demand the skills that they're offering. So there's this structural issue that is exacerbating what we also see as kind of a cyclical downturn. If you go one more, Julie. And so then I'll turn it over to Kayla and we'll talk about kind of maybe some of the not disconnect, but these two stories that we're seeing of sort of growing anxiety around your job loss concerns, elevated reporting of experiencing pay losses, and yet for many high income adults, relatively stable unemployment.
Yeah, and I do think also there is a little bit of a indirect like sort of household component there where, for example, anytime if there's a married couple and one of them loses their job, the whole household, that's at least two people's sentiment going down. So the concerns and it's not necessarily only about your own job. So it could make sense how it kind of like spreads around. It makes you more worried for yourself hearing about friends getting laid off or seeing LinkedIn posts of people having trouble with their job searches. But it also can materially affect more people's circumstances than just you when a job is lost. Anyway, and John and I have talked a lot about this, or actually really the whole econ team has talked about this, how the lost pay data connects to our unemployment index, which is really Morning Consult's measure of unemployment, similar or the same definition as the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses for theirs, but we ask it on a daily basis with a simplified question framework, and we present it as an index just to not distract with different percentages. But so, I mean, really the basic difference here between what you see in the lost pay data versus what you see in the unemployment index would be the lost pay is really measuring the lost pay data that John just showed is measuring more the flows of, did you lose income or not? And this is a little bit more the stock of how much is that filtering through to actually an accumulation in a jobless share of the population. And I think the lower income story really shows up kind of clearly there. You see, especially with the hiring environment that we've seen over the past year, the low hire, low fire, not even as relatively few people were maybe losing jobs or having, really losing jobs. Um, that accumulated over time. And you see it in the continuing claims data too, but you see, like, so that led to this gradual increase in unemployment, most pronounced among the lower income segment. And what was interesting is in 2025, again, it's a little hard to see with the scale on the chart, but the bottom line, the high income group, it was actually heading in the opposite direction. And this, I would argue, is one of the things that really helped fuel that K-shaped economy, the difference that we saw in labor outcomes for lower income segments versus higher income segments. There's a lot higher turnover in jobs, in lower paying jobs. Think about retail workers. They maybe will job hop a little more often. Maybe there's more layoffs there too, compared to sort of more stability in higher paying sectors where someone wouldn't maybe leave their job unless they had one lined up. or were laid off, and we didn't have very many layoffs. So that helps to explain why we saw more of that rise in unemployment from the lower income group, because even if the amount of layoffs was relatively low, the time it took them to find a new job was just getting longer and longer and longer, and that really led to that accumulation. The other notable thing, though, again, looking at the very tail end of this chart, even in our unemployment index, which is a little bit slower to respond than the lost pay and income, you see this uptick in the share of adults saying they don't have jobs, for the high income cohort as well. And I've tried to summarize that with the slide on the right, showing sort of the comparison of the net change in unemployment by income. Um, since year over year, there is still a lot of kind of residual benefits that the high income cohort has. They actually have a lower unemployment index level than they had a year ago. However, since the start of 2025, everyone's kind of been moving up, and we would expect that to continue because it might take a little bit more time for some of what we're seeing in the lost pay to filter through to this.
I think also one of the things that is just to kind of put a pin in it or to double tap that seems so important to me to highlight to folks on this call is that the amount of money that folks are making in terms of their jobs is obviously one dimension, but it's not everything. It's also the industry where they're working. We're using it as a proxy for so many different things, but it's the industry where they're working. It's whether or not they're salaried or hourly workers. And so those dimensions are really important for folks who are selling to these consumers to understand, like, where exactly do your consumers work? What is the nature of their job? And I think that's going to tell you a lot about how they're going to respond to, economic shocks, to AI shocks over the course of 2026. And of course, that has pretty direct implications for their spending capacity as well. Sorry
Mhm.
for interjecting, Kayla.
Oh no, that was good. And we could, yeah, we can move right on to the next slide. So yeah, so we've talked about sentiment, we've talked about labor outcomes, we've talked a little bit about spending, and I did sort of tease there was another K shape coming. And this is really the chart that I had in mind. This is sort of our higher frequency. It has less detail than our monthly consumer spending data, but it is our sort of a higher frequency metric it is benchmarked to track annual spending growth in government data, and that is the Consumer Health Index, which I'm showing here by income. So it's roughly equivalent to, if you think of zero as sort of neutral growth, it's at the all adults level, it's roughly equivalent to like percentages growth in spending. Not necessarily the same at the income levels, but that's roughly how you can think about it. And this is, I think, a chart that really, really clearly shows that K-shape economy in 2025, really shows, the low income adults suffering more from these labor outcomes and trending down, whereas the high income adults had growth and stability until the very beginning of this year. What this does is it draws together our sentiment data and our unemployment data, into this single metric that, like I said, is intended to be pinned a little bit more directly to actual spending and overall demand. Um, so this is, you see that the sentiment factor has shown up in this. What you probably haven't seen yet is how the unemployment changes will filter through to this, because those actually act on a lag in this index. I like to think of it as the one part, the sort of employment part of this is it's factored in as actually lagged changes in unemployment. And that's because it takes a while for you to change your spending habits when your job situation changes. Maybe there's severance, you have savings when you're laid off. And alternatively, when you get a new job, it might take a little while for the difference in paycheck to kind of filter through. And that unemployment part tends to filter through to like what you actually are able to spend, whereas sentiment seems a little bit more tied to what you feel like spending. And that in this index translates to just and it moves up and down contemporaneously with the index. So there's the slow moving part, the labor market part, and then there's the fast moving real time part, which is the sentiment part. And so for that reason, we can kind of expect to see from the unemployment thing, those developments that we recently saw weakening for the high income cohort, that may show up in the coming weeks and months a little bit more in this index, whereas sentiment will have already filtered through. And we can move to the next slide. Another piece of evidence and another sort of way that we're triangulating this signal across our data is something called our price sensitivity index. Again, showing it by our different income groups here. The sensitivity index tracks how willing people are to walk away from a purchase because the price was too high. It's kind of like the net share between people who saw a higher price and bought it anyway versus saw a higher price and said, okay, I'm not going to buy it and walked away. And then in this way that we're showing it, we're aggregating it across the different categories that we track to get kind of top line price sensitivity. And as you would expect, high income adults overall, the level of price sensitivity tends to be lower with them. They have more discretionary income, more ability to make these purchases and absorb higher prices when they encounter them. But in our most recent month of data, our January data, we saw this really kind of dramatic spike for that group. And this is really about those sort of marginal transaction purchases, like as you're deciding, should I spend on this extra thing or not? Whereas our monthly spending data is more tracking your regular expenses for the most part. I mean, this would show up in there, but the bulk of expenses are things like your housing payment, your gas payment, your car payment. So this is less about those recurring payments and it's about those, do I want to buy this thing this month or not? So
And
so for
just to,
that reason, yeah,
well, I was just going to chime in, like what we're showing here is an average, but this is an average across 20 different subcategories, right? So folks who are really
exactly.
power users try to dive in are going to go understand, like, for the thing that I sell for used cars, how are people changing their purchasing habits when they encounter higher than expected prices?
Yes. And for the high income group, this was actually pretty broad based across, I think, every category. It wasn't this
Yeah.
dramatic across every category. But it was, a general trend across purchases in January. Now, some amount of that, this isn't seasonally adjusted. Some amount of it may have been a little seasonally adjusted, I mean, seasonally driven because it's post holidays, so you're like, okay, I already bought that. But if you look at the year over year, and this I think actually should say January, sorry, that was a typo by me. Year over year, that's sort of a rough form of seasonal adjustment. You see this huge spike again in the 100K versus the other groups, which were a little bit closer to their year ago levels. And to John's point, also for those who are interested and curious about this series, we also are, yeah, we track it across like 20 categories for things like, the restaurants, groceries, things like that. What we've also done, which is really fun and interesting, sorry to diverge a little bit here, is dig into subcategories. And because we have this long-term tracking for the larger category, we can then do like a one-time pulse and calculate these scores and look at things like price sensitivity versus trading down for all of the little subcategories within a group. So within groceries, you might look at meat versus produce versus desserts or things like that and get a clearer picture of how consumers are responding to prices and within the category. So yeah, just a little plug for some fun data that we can do with this series. And we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this we threw in a little last minute because there was some news today. Um, yeah, we're all scampering around trying to get where we're going to be going into field and collecting some, consumer responses to this data as we speak. This is in the works, but we have been running this tariff tracker since the tariffs were kind of even rumored about. I think we even before they were implemented, but since Trump was elected, we even were collecting views. So I just wanted to. None of this is the consumer reaction, but I wanted to level set with this slide, sort of how consumers were feeling about tariffs before the Supreme Court decision, which if anyone didn't see the news, the Supreme Court struck down a lot of Trump's tariffs. Not all of them, but many of them declared illegal. So we are all still working through the ramifications of that. But I thought, again, looking at our income groups, these are some charts from our tariff tracker looking at net approval. Overall, across all the income groups, net approval, I would say, was like pretty low and neutral. A chart I didn't include here, though, this is how much whether they approve of tariffs on net, but we also ask about how they think it affects the economy overall and their personal finances. These are net to slightly positive. For the ones about how it affects their finances and the economy, it's actually slightly negative across all income groups. So there is a little bit of a, oh, okay. There seems to be a little bit more willingness to be like, oh, it must be good for something, whether politically or national security wise. But overall, the net feeling is that tariffs are not that great for the economy and not that great for household finances, of course, with partisan splits. But so the assumption would be that this news will be relatively well received by consumers. Driving home that point on the right, we have some of the concerns that consumers have about tariffs. And really, given the very cost sensitive environment that we've seen over the past few years, with inflation running above target for since 2022, maybe late 2021, um, consumers are very concerned about prices. The number one concern here related to tariffs is the price of essential items, but consumers are also more generally concerned for their household finances too. So overall, evidence that consumers will be a little bit buoyed by this news, yet to be seen in the data, but we're collecting it as we speak. Next slide.
Yeah, maybe I can offer some additional kind of reasons for optimism. So I think what we tried to show thus far is that there was this sort of shock to consumers, particularly high-income consumers, at the end of December, driven by downturn in the labor market and broader labor market concerns that we think will continue to sort of spill through and start to affect unemployment, but probably not for but that spillover from pay loss rate to unemployment is likely to be less for high income adults than it is for low income adults. Then we moved, and Kayla just mentioned sort of the letting up, so to speak, or the likely removal of tariffs across a wide range of goods. This is another reason I think that we should be, not think that the end is imminent and that there are reasons for optimism, and it's that the financial health of consumers, particularly high-end consumers, remains strong. I mean, to put it bluntly. So what we do is every month we are tracking a really wide range of income sources, what money is coming in, and then debt types, what money is going out, and we try to understand essentially the sustainability of consumers' debt levels, debt repayment capacity every month. And we do that through something called the financial obligations ratio. So if you go to the next slide, we're just going to track here over time the financial obligations ratio on the left-hand side of adults in different income groups. You can see fairly clearly that lower income adults are essentially more overextended. It doesn't mean that they have more debt. It means that their debt relative to their incomes is higher. But it peaked really for all groups in mid Q3 2024 and has been stable since then. That low level for high income adults, I think, is a reason to be fairly optimistic. If you just play this out, how potentially this could all play out, right? You have maybe elevated layoffs lead to folks becoming unemployed. There is still the capacity uh, for higher income adults to go out and rely increasingly on credit to make purchases, right? So they're just in a different financial position than middle and low income consumers. And it means that the way they respond to a downturn in the labor market is going to be different. And I think they're going to have a longer buffer. The other thing that we're tracking on the right-hand side, just to be sort of very concrete, is like how concerned are they about repaying their credit card debt every month. And here again, high income adults have a very high share. A lot of them have credit card debt, but they're not concerned about making those repayments. So I think the likelihood of a delinquency or default among high income adults for credit card debt remains fairly low. We will continue to track this, or we are tracking it every month. But it's another reason again to just say like, cool, even if there are widespread layoffs, even if AI is extremely disruptive, there is a time horizon. It's not forever, but there's a time horizon where high income adults are going to be able to continue to make payments, continue to drive spending by relying on credit. And then the next slide, I'll quickly conclude here and say it's not just spending, it's also the savings buffer. So this is the share of consumers here who have money left over each month relative to those who don't after paying all their basic expenses. You can see that it's a high share of adults in that high income group. 75+% say that they have money left over each month after paying their basic expenses. It's another way that high income adults are just very different and more protected from downturns in the labor market than middle and low income adults. And so, as we're thinking about the broader picture, obviously, I think what we saw at the end of December was very, very concerning, but it doesn't mean that the end is imminent necessarily for the spending power of this group. So I'll just maybe conclude with one very concrete slide, Julie, on the next picture, which is say, well, what I've talked about thus far is the macro, and then we talked about some different industry dynamics. And now, just to be very kind of clear, like what's going on at the brand level, and that's really what is unique about the way that we approach our work is trying to figure out how these macro dynamics affect particular companies and the things that they're selling. And so, across a pretty wide range of industries, for both for like the durable goods, but then also for um, some of the discretionary non-durables, you're seeing a downturn in net purchasing consideration among higher income consumers. And so, it's not surprising that autos, for example, the auto companies heavily rely on high income consumers. So you got to go through and really do a sort of industry by industry, company by company analysis. But this is the sort of work that I think is incumbent on us as your advisors and as you guys as clients to go think about how this downshift in high income sentiment is likely to play out in terms of the purchasing power and then also the purchasing intentions for the things that companies are selling. I know we're a little over time. I'm going to conclude just very quickly. We're going to launch a poll right now, and I think we're interested in hearing from everyone here. There's kind of two ways that we could try to connect with you. One would be to just share with you the deck that we have and give you a little early access to kind of how we're thinking about this, and the other would be to connect with folks from our team. If you wouldn't mind taking a second to just answer the poll, that's going to help us understand kind of how we can be more responsive to your needs going forward. And then I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you. Really great content. Thanks so much, John and Kayla, for walking us through that. We have some time. We've had some great questions coming in, so I'm actually going to stop sharing right now, and would love to sort of answer some of these questions in real time. So if you have submitted questions, we'll get to those. If you have questions, again, just as a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, you can submit questions through the Q&A feature to the panelists directly. So, John, just to kind of kick us off, you started to hit on it here. I think one of the questions that I'm always getting from our clients is, how are others really using this consumer sentiment data in their planning? Like, what should they do, right now, sort of following this conversation?
Yeah. I think there's a basic step that a lot of companies don't do that they should do, which is to understand who their customers are. So like if you were in the financial services world, you would try to get your arms around the exposure you face to a particular industry or something like that. In this case, I would get your arms around your exposure to high income consumers. What share of your customers or your users are making $100,000 or more? And then where are they working? What's their employment status? I think that's going to give you a really good sense, not only of how they have responded, but how they are likely to respond over the course of 2026 to future macro geopolitical shocks. That's like a table stakes first order exercise. The follow on from that, I think, would be to go in a step deeper, right? And start figuring out how did your brand or your company, how did purchasing consideration or usage of your products change, or not only contemporary, but also future net purchasing consideration. And again, I think that's going to be heavily driven by your exposure to that high income group, which, as we showed in that final slide, made some pretty significant pullbacks. Maybe the positive I will say, just to be not to be too pessimistic, is that my sense is that the reduction in tariffs has a very strong potential to actually boost total purchase consideration. And as Kayla has repeatedly mentioned, I think we're likely to see tax refunds come in higher than expected. So there are some good reasons to believe that things won't be as negative maybe as we would have thought like a week ago.
Yeah, that's great. Kayla, I'm going to pose the next question to you. We had a number of questions come in regarding our consumer health index. So I think that's a really interesting index that you've built. So the question is your consumer health index metric just at the income level for all adults, or can you look at it more granularly for a specific brand or audience?
Yeah, so it's actually because the components of it are run on our daily surveys, it's actually able to be paired with any of our audience data the same way as the index of consumer sentiment is. The history doesn't go back quite as far because of the lagged aspect of the unemployment index. It starts in late 2021. But via our API, you can create any custom audiences that you want with the consumer health index. And there's plenty of very interesting looks. And feel free to reach out to me if you want any help with that. I love sharing consumer health index charts.
Yeah, I can personally attest. Kayla and John are great resources and really great sort of walking through the data. So definitely reach out and we can set up those conversations if that's of interest. Okay, another question, John, Kayla, either of you can jump in and answer. Do pay loss expectations include impacts on spending power by inflation or increasing costs for things like benefits, or is it truly just take-home pay based?
I think it's primarily the latter. I mean, we separately are tracking things like inflation expectations, and then of course all the price surprise and price sensitivity data that Kayla showed is going to track how changes in prices are affecting purchasing power. This is a slightly different metric, which is really focused on whether or not people had their hours reduced, whether or not they were laid off, put on furlough, or ultimately fired. And it's a way of kind of rolling that all up into a single metric that then you can track over time across all these demographic groups.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like UI claims plus because
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
broader measure than that. I mean, it often will track similarly to UI claims, but not always. And the times when it doesn't is maybe more interesting than when it does.
Right. Somewhat sort of related to sort of the point you're making, Kayla, about the granularity of the data. So one of the questions that we got was, can you break down sentiment by geography? And are certain regions seeing bigger drops than others?
I know in the, I mean, I know in the consumer health index, and I think the ICS component was the one driving this more so. Sorry, I've just been looking more at my consumer health index this week specifically. So the most up-to-date data. Um, it kind of aligned actually with where higher income consumers are more prevalent. So most recently there was kind of a big spike in the West, and that is also the area where we had seen the most growth last year because I like to put it as like headwinds and tailwinds, and then the way consumers when it comes to like the K-shaped economy or really the K-shaped economies, because there's more than just income as a line where things are being bifurcated. It kind of comes to how exposed are these consumers to the tailwinds in the economy right now, which one of the biggest ones, maybe the biggest one, AI, consumers located in the West, they're disproportionately have benefited from that, but they also might be disproportionately kind of jittery about its implications and things like that. With the labor market. So we've seen a lot of kind of volatility in the West region recently. The Northeast as well, relative to the other regions, on average, will have a higher income level, a little bit more adults earning that 100K plus group. So a little more negative, a little bit of a larger decline there as well recently.
One thing that we have done for some folks, particularly retail companies, is they'll just give us the zip codes where they have stores, and then we can go build custom audiences. And we do this monthly now with the American City Business Journals, where we're producing MSA level consumer sentiment data to get that kind of real-time pulse of what's going on at a local community. And obviously, when you have these big shocks, not all areas of the economy feel the AI shock, as Kayla mentioned similarly.
Yeah, great. And I think we've got time for one last question. As we sort of look at this drop in consumer sentiment, are you able to attach it to some specific event or set of events? Is it out of timing or something else?
Oh, I mean, I think what I tried to argue here was that it was really driven by a weakening in the labor market for that group, paired with exacerbated by broader kind of AI concerns. And so you could think about basically the US consumer, particularly high income consumers, entering this period where any negative shock, no matter how small, is going to be magnified because they're on the edge of their seat, concerned that AI is going to eliminate their job. I mean, that's like an oversimplified version of what's going on, but I think that's a lot of what's driving this right now.
It's almost like a sentiment bubble, the same way you'll
Yeah.
just have bubbles in the stock market, and they kind of sometimes they pop almost for, it's like the timing of when they pop is kind of uncertain. What's interesting is that the two bubbles did not, I'm not saying that there's a bubble, but there there was no bubble pop in the stock market, which yeah, and it's interesting because that high income group specifically is so tuned into what's happening with stocks. So yeah, the difference in sentiment and stock market outcomes, as John talked about a lot, is interesting here.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of wraps up the questions that we've gotten from the attendees. Really appreciate the conversation today, John and Kayla. Really interesting insights and a lot of great data to dig into. So looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you on the line. We're happy to connect after. Feel free to reach out directly to John and Kayla or myself, and we'll make sure to follow up with the report if that is something that was of interest to you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.